All right, so we started recording. And so first we're going to hear from Lincoln. He's going to tell us a little bit about history of war tax resistance, why do it, how to do it, those kinds of things. And then we'll hear from Mary and Larry and Mandy, who will each be telling their own story. And Lincoln is telling us that the chat will not be part of the recording. So whatever you put in there, it's not going to go up publicly after this. It's just for us to communicate in here. Yeah, and then after that, we'll have time for questions and answers. I think that's it. Okay, Lincoln.
All right, thank you, Catherine. I'm just making a few housekeeping things for the recording, and then I'll, all right, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Lincoln Rice. I'm the coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, and I've been holding that position as the coordinator for about the last 3.5 years, and have been a war tax resistor going back to 1998. So yeah, I'm going to be sharing some of the background, as Catherine said, and I'm going to lead us through a PowerPoint presentation on this to make it a little more interesting. And so hopefully you should be seeing that now. How do I? Sorry, I can't. Zoom is preventing me from getting to the button that turns this into, move out of the way, Zoom.
Sometimes you can get more space by hitting the escape button.
I think I got it. Here we go. All right. So again, this is the National War, I'm with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Everything I'll be sharing is also available on our website. So again, why are most of us probably here? I'm assuming if you're here at this session today, it's probably largely because of a concern of the amount of funds used by that are directed from our taxes to the U.S. military for past and current military expenses. And so every year the War Resisters League puts out a wonderful pie chart. And actually the new one just went up a few days ago, but this is the one from last year. So there are some minor changes, but essentially you can see in any given year, past and current military expenses normally take up close to half of those taxes that are due on April 14th. For those of you that might remember getting the booklet, or maybe still get the 1040 booklet at your local library that has the instructions, the military portion might seem smaller, and part of the reason for that is there's also interest on the national debt, which is largely because of military spending. So here, the folks at the War Resisters League have kind of gone through line item by line item to put together a more accurate pie chart. So many of you are probably familiar with this, but it's a good resource. But also, it's not just that money goes towards the military, it's what is it actually used for? So obviously, we know, even during the invasion of Ukraine, the United States is still involved in drone warfare in different parts of the world. They've been bombing places in different parts of the world, killing innocent people in different parts of the world. And so there's just the normal military use of our budget. For many folks in our movement, there are additional reasons that build on our military presence all over the world, including things like border militarization, deportations, federal prisons, the amount of money that's been, the amount of resources and tools that have been directed from the military to the police through the 1033 program. So here you can see an example of a Lakeland, Florida tank that they received as part of the 1033 program. So it was a military tank.
Lincoln, we're still seeing that first slide.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh boy. I'm sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know. Well, because now you can see all the slides on my left, right?
Yes, and now we can see the pie chart.
Yeah.
It's just moved.
I'm sorry, the Zoom. I guess I'll just have to do it this way. I've never ran into this problem, but Zoom is not letting me get to the button to switch. I'm sure there must be a way to do it on top.
When you hit your cursor on the slide, it actually opened up for us. So if you put the cursor on the slide to the left, it seems to open that up.
Yeah, but I wanted to go to the view so that all you see is the slide. It's on the bottom of my screen where my Zoom controls are, and I can't. Maybe it's. Anyways, I'm very sorry.
You have to make Zoom not full screen.
I've never had this problem before.
Well,
Sorry,
it works. We can see the pie chart now,
Yeah.
so you can just go through this way.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize for this technical difficulty. So here you can see the picture of the tank owned by the Lakeland Police Department that they got from the United States military. You know, as a side note, under the Obama administration, he curtailed some of the 1033 program. So actually during some of the Obama years, the later Obama years, Lakeland actually lost their tank. They had to give it back. And then when Trump came, they got their tank back and they've had it since. So to the best of my knowledge, Biden hasn't made any moves to limit the 1033 program that's coming into office. So we definitely see, you know, when you see pictures on the television that we often saw when the Black Lives Matter protests are at their height and you saw police with all these military grade weapons, those are weapons that they received from the US military through this program. Also the impact on the environment. The US military is the #1 institutional user of oil in the world, so a major contributor to greenhouse gases. A fighter jet flying in the air for 1 hour uses the same amount of gas that the average American uses driving their car in about 2 years. You know, so all of us can kind of do our part, either not drive less, but every time, you know, if there's an air show, just think of all of the fuel that's being used. And this is, you know, 70% of the fuel used by the military is used by airplanes. So the drones and airplanes just use an enormous amount of fuel, more than some countries use. Torture, war crimes, and especially early on, some of the COVID response, and as we continue to go through some of the COVID response, you know, has been inadequate because of resources being diverted to the military. So just some highlighting a little bit of war tax resistance in history. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you know, the earliest recorded instance of war tax resistance in the United States happened in the early 17th century when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes for a Dutch fort. Then we see, you know, Quaker practice of war tax resistance, and you know, especially our current form of war tax resistance, or our current movement of war tax resistance in the United States really begins post World War II, but grew substantially in the wake of the Vietnam era. You know, essentially, within any civilization that we have enough information about, we can usually find instances of war tax resistance. It's a common practice that has been common throughout human history. So there are two common ways that folks resist. There's to refuse to pay some or all of one's income taxes that one owes, and then make a decision about whether to file or not. When one is refusing, it is a form of civil disobedience. There could be penalties. We'll touch a little bit on those very briefly. There is a legal method, which some folks do, is to earn less than the taxable limit. And then that way you legally don't owe any taxes. And it's probably usually also healthier for the planet. If you're an employee, meaning you're not self-employed, you know, you were hired by a corporation or perhaps another person, you receive a W-2 at the end of the year. When you first start your job there, you get a W-4, which is letting your employer know how much to take out to divert to for income taxes at the end of the year. And so I'll be putting in the chat some resources about how to do W-4 resistance and some other things I've been talking about later on. But this is a form that anyone can have asked to adjust at any time, because even if you decided, well, I don't know if I want to do war tax resistance, if you're getting a refund right now, it's probably because you're giving the government essentially a free loan to be using for these military projects. And so one could at least stop giving the federal government a free loan. For people who are self-employed, it's much easier to be a war tax resistor because there is nothing withheld. They fill out a form for who they fill out a form for the company or person they're contracted with, but that's just for reporting purposes. Nothing's withheld. They make a decision during the year or at the end of the year if they want to pay. So, and then for people who do owe taxes, there's filing or not filing. So there are advantages to both. For people who file, you know that your taxes will be accurate. It allows folks to send a letter of protest to explain what's going on. It does make collection slightly easier because you're letting the IRS know where you are. But another advantage is once your taxes are accepted by the IRS, it begins the 10-year once your tax forms are accepted by the IRS, it starts the 10-year statute of limitations. So if they do not collect that tax within 10 years, then you don't owe anything. Also, filing makes it easier to apply for things like scholarships, health insurance subsidies, etc. For those who decide not to file, there potentially is no statute of limitations. The penalties can sometimes be more severe, but many people who do it because it's much harder for the IRS to track them. And many of them often never hear from the IRS. So with the remainder of my time talking about some myths of war tax resistance. So there's this thought that if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to go to jail. Essentially, there are only 2 people since World War II that have gone to jail simply for not paying their taxes, for refusing. One was Ernest Bromley in 1942, who was imprisoned for 2 months for refusing to buy a war tax stamp for his car. The other was Tony Serra in 2005 for failure to pay. He spent 10 months in prison. This is very rare. Technically, anyone could go to jail for just refusing to pay. But at least this last instance in 2005, Tony Serra is a lawyer in the Bay Area, and it appeared they just really felt if a lawyer is doing this, that means they totally understand that what they're doing is wrong more than the average person. So it seemed they wanted to make more of an example out of him. Otherwise, in the last 25 years, the only war tax resistors who have done any prison time, it's because they've falsified tax forms. So that is something that we wouldn't normally recommend for anyone's situation. Falsifying tax forms and misleading the IRS in that way is one of the few reasons that the IRS will use its limited resources to go after a war tax resistor. Otherwise, they normally will just focus on different collection methods. They rarely would go after anyone criminally, except, as I said, for fraud, lying on putting incorrect information on one's tax forms. So some other myths about war tax resistance: they'll take my property. We saw a huge move away from this, partially in the late 90s. The federal government changed the law about how the IRS does property seizures because there had been some abuse with the program. So since the early mid 90s, we see a huge decrease in seizures from 10,000 a year to maybe a couple hundred a year. So it's, since that decrease happened, we haven't actually known anyone in the movement who's lost any property. Previous to this, would happen every once in a while that a war tax resistor might have their house confiscated. Technically, that can happen if someone has a tax debt of over $5,000. But like I said, it's just not the way that the IRS practices at the moment. Though, as we like to remind folks, they could change that, but right now that is how things are happening. So lastly, what does the IRS actually do? Sometimes they will garnish someone's salary, though it's more, as I like to tell people, that's the reverse lottery. I may be here in the office for Nutric maybe once a year, usually less. I'll get a call where someone's salary has been garnished for being a war tax resistor. What is extremely common is if someone is receiving Social Security, to have that garnished. That actually is extremely common because it's very easy for the IRS to do and doesn't use many of their resources. Bank account seizures sometimes happen. Again, it's very rare. State refund seizures, if you accidentally pay too much, if you have a state tax, that is semi-regular. It does happen. Interest and penalties will build if you don't pay. Difficulty in getting student loans, that's more if you're a non-filer. If you file, we haven't seen any issue with people getting student loans for themselves or their children, as long as they're honest on their tax forms. If you owe over $20,000, they may file a public lien with your county. In the past, it's sometimes affected people's credit. It could also mean that if you owned a home and sold it, they might get first dibs at the sale. And then lastly, this is rather new, it went into effect 4 years ago, is loss of passport, or as loss of the ability to get a new passport. If someone has a tax debt of over $54,000, they cannot renew their passport. And so we have seen a handful of folks in our network get those letters. But otherwise, if that was something that someone wanted to avoid, we recommend making sure you don't go above the $54,000 mark. So I'll leave it here. I'm going to put some of this information in the chat. And then if anyone has any other questions or comments, we can get to that after the rest of our wonderful panelists have spoken. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, thanks, Lincoln. So we're going to move on to some stories. I've gotten a couple of questions in the chat, but not very many. So if anyone has any other questions, definitely feel free to put them in the chat. So I heard that somebody's interested in hearing kind of more about the nuts and bolts for 2021, updated resources that would be helpful in filing this year, national escrow funds to contribute to that are endorsed by Nutric, and also tax prep professionals that are trusted by Nutric that could advise on LLC filing to strengthen one's self-employment accounting. So those are the questions I've seen so far. So some kind of nuts and bolts things, but also, we also really want to hear people's stories. So if that helps you steer what you're talking about, that's great. Or we could also save it for Q&A because we have a long section at the end for just Q&A and general discussion. Okay, so let's turn it over to Mary.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for spending part of your Sunday afternoon or wherever part of the day it is for you. I am Mary. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, in a part that's unceded land of the Massachusetts tribe. And I became a war tax resistor in 1983. While I was in college, the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, reinstituted registration for the draft. And I was such a feminist back then, and still am, that I just assumed that registration for the draft for men would soon be changed to include registration of the draft for women. So I started thinking, could I do this? Could I take up arms for my country and potentially involved in violence on behalf of my country? And I decided that I could not do this. So I registered with the Central Committee on Conscientious Objection as a conscientious objector, and waited for registration for women to start, and it never did. But instead, what we have is an economic draft, which means that poor people, in order to get some education, in order to get resources, end up joining the military. But back to war test resistance. When I got out of college, that's when I started thinking about how to take my conscientious objection to war to my taxes. So I have since done that in these almost 30 years of war tax resistance in various ways. I have, for some years, earned below the taxable income, which, as Lincoln said, is easy. If you don't owe taxes, then you're not paying into the military-industrial complex. I lived and worked in Brazil for 5.5 years, and there my income was foreign earned income. And so for those 5.5 years, I did not have US taxable income. But for most of my tax resistance, I have filed and not paid half of my taxes. I have jobs, or I've been a contractor, and file a form and attach to that form the pie chart that Lincoln showed us, that shows where our income taxes go each year. And it's pretty regularly every year, about 50% of our revenue that comes in through taxes goes for wars, past wars, research into weapons, all that stuff. And I send a letter to the IRS that says I would gladly pay all of my taxes if I could pay it all for good things: housing, healthcare, sustaining our precious planet, sustaining people, and recovering from the violence of war. Unfortunately, that is not an option in our current system. Oh, I forgot to turn my timer on. Well, all right, I'll put it on now, and somebody call me in if I go over. So I put in a letter saying I would gladly pay all of it if I could not pay for killing and preparation for killing. And I include a quote from Eisenhower, the former president, the former general, and often it's former generals who say the darndest things about war. The quote that I put in says, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hope of its children." And he goes on. This is in his Chance for Peace speech, also known as the Cross of Iron speech, on April 16th, 1953. And I sent that letter to the IRS. In the 90s, I got visits from IRS officers. I got calls, and occasionally I have had, in the 90s, money taken from my bank account or from my paycheck. I've been able to resist way, way more than they have ever collected. And because I've been doing it for so long, and there's that 10-year time limit for collection, there's money that they cannot take. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you? So when I tell people about this, I say it's a little bit of resistance with each paycheck. And what makes me different, what makes us as tax resistors different than someone who just doesn't like taxes, is a lot of us would pay all of our taxes if we could not pay for weapons and war. That is not currently an option in our society. And we redirect whatever we don't pay to good things that we would like our government to fund. So over the years, I've been able to support victims of war in various countries. I've been able to support refugees and immigrants from countries torn apart by our violence. I've been able to support young people learning about how to resist violence and how to support social change. I've been able to do work that that supports healthcare, housing, let's see, what else? Immigrants, young people, climate sustainability. It's that redirecting of our money from violence to life that is what makes us as war tax resistors different than someone who just doesn't like taxes and won't pay. And Larry and I, as part of New England War Tax Resistance and our grant committee, we have an alternative fund that people who are war tax resistors or want to be supportive of redirecting our funds in this way, put money in this fund. And then each year, we give some of this money away to organizations locally and nationally that are working for human rights, for justice, peace, healing the wounds of war. And we're going to be giving away over $10,000 this year to those kinds of organizations. And it's the best thing. I get to put my money personally and our collective money into good things and be proud of the things that our money is going towards. So yeah, that's my story. And I'd be happy to answer questions later, but it's the redirection of our money from violence to life, from hate to love, that is what motivates my war tax resistance and keeps me doing it all these years. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Mary. Now let's move on to Larry.
Okay, I'm Larry Rosenwald. I've been teaching English and Peace and Justice Studies at Wellesley College since 1980, and my wife, Cynthia Schwan, and I have been war tax resistors since 1987. So a long time and a lot of stories, and I'll focus on just a few. A couple from the beginning. I think it's important to be candid about personal motives as well as political ones, so I'll tell you what my personal motives were at the beginning. I was against the Vietnam War, but timid in relation to it, and I was inspired and intimidated, I would say, by those who were more courageous in their resistance, and I felt I owed them a debt. In particular, I felt I owed a debt to my high school friend and activist, the late Chuck Mathai. So when I was at an event, subsequently a war tax resistance related event, and Chuck was there also, I thought, hallelujah, this is where I want to be. So indebtedness is the first motive. And the second is rebellion against my parents by going further left than they did, by going against the systems they at bottom maintained allegiance to. So gratitude and rebellion. The second remark about the beginnings, I think probably if you were constructing an ideal order for becoming a war tax resistor, you would imagine somebody realizing they were opposed to war and then realizing that maybe they didn't want to pay for it. I got nothing against that order, but it wasn't mine. I became a war tax resistor first. I needed to take the action first and then to think about what it meant. So I resisted and then I became a pacifist. When Moses comes down from the mountain, I'm aware that this is an exalted comparison, just bear with me. Bearing the tablets of the law, the children of Israel say to him, Na'aseh Shema, which means we will do and we will hear, and tradition understands that as meaning that the Israelites are saying, we'll do the things that the law commands us, and then we'll figure out what they mean. We'll listen to them. So that's my order, action first and then reflection. So that brings me to say a couple of things about my practice in the years between 1987 and now. One friend of mine calls it vanilla flavored war tax resistance. I get what that friend means. We send a letter to the IRS with that same Eisenhower statement that Mary quoted. We compute the military percentage, the current military percentage usually, of the federal budget. We deduct that percentage from the tax we owe. We transfer the refused taxes to a progressive escrow fund. The interest is used for good causes and the principal remains available if we need it. Then we wait. We get letters from the automated collection service and we get levied, we get garnished repeatedly at my place of work and at our bank. And the IRS seizes the money and charges interest and penalties, which is to say that what we do is a bad way of keeping money from the government. It's a good way of bearing witness to our refusal to collaborate with an evil system, in Martin Luther King's phrase, and bearing witness is important to me, which means that vanilla-flavored war tax resistance has turned out to be very, very public war tax resistance. I've written essays about it, I've given talks, I've been in, like this one this afternoon, I've been in conversations with colleagues and students. Some of the colleagues offered us money when we were levied. We've had conversations with our kids. I hate being levied. But when levied, I have always tried to reach out to make connections. I have told my colleagues and my students and the people at our bank and my congregation. I have also tried to think of being levied as a wound incurred in the service of an ideal, an action meriting whatever the pacifist equivalent of a Purple Heart might be. Vanilla-flavored war tax resistance has also turned out to involve a lot of connections with institutions. Very strikingly, unlike Thoreau, who inspired me and who refused to pay his taxes in order to clear his conscience and then went back, or wanted to go back, to huckleberry picking on the Concord Hills. I didn't do that. Instead, I joined the Grants and Loans Committee of New England War Tax Resistance, as Mary mentioned. I'm still a member of that. I was a member of the board and then left the board. I was a delegate to several international conferences on war tax resistance and peace tax funds. I made a lot of friends and I cherish them still. All of that is the upside, and what remains is going to be the downside, just so you know. And I'll finish and then Mandy can cheer you up. I had at the start and in those early days a sense that war tax resistance was not only a righteous act, but also a source of power. A friend of mine, a journal editor and novelist named Askold Melnichuk, who published an essay of mine on war tax resistance, said that he'd liked to refer to me as the most dangerous man in Massachusetts. I mean, that's preposterous, right? I mean, look at me. But what Askold was imagining, and what I was imagining too, was the power that war tax resistance might have if war tax resistors got their act together, named their goals, imposed some movement disciplines, because all movements have discipline, took action. It was exciting to think of, and it is still. But it's not going to happen. And the state I find myself in now is quite different from that earlier, more hopeful, more visionary state. War tax resistors are too diverse, too laissez-faire in their relations to other war tax resistors, too little interested in exercising power for that to happen. In fairness, I should note that the government has been good at making war tax resistance harder and making it harder even to owe taxes in the first place. And also in fairness, I should note that European peace tax people are better at this than Americans are, more willing to agree on goals and more willing to work with existing institutions, whether governmental or ecclesiastical. So where am I these days? 35 years into a life of doing war tax resistance. I regard war tax resistance as a good spiritual exercise. I borrow that phrase from notable war tax resistor Randy Keeler. It feels more right to refuse than to pay. It's good for someone as timid as I am, so constrained by routine and discipline, to do something that feels even a little bit risky. I like helping distribute the interest of refused taxes to progressive organizations, as Mary just beautifully evoked the joy of. But there are no more dramas here. The IRS, not for me at any rate, the IRS just takes a little of what we refused from each Social Security check we received. It's boring and predictable and undramatic and impossible to avert. And there is, in my judgment, no political power here either. And that, I confess, makes me sad. Thank you.
Well, this is Mandy Carter here in Durham, North Carolina, where the Lumbee and the Cherokee indigenous communities are. I'm glad that that I got to hear Mary, your story, and yours, Larry, and also Lincoln, all the big picture stuff around Newtrick and the tax resistance. For me, I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's a bag that has WRL. It was our 90th anniversary, whatever years it ago. But my entree was when I had in 1967, when we were resisting the war at the Oakland Induction Center. I was 19, and I sat in opposition to that war, and went off to Santa Rita jail, and really thought about the idea about how people would say no to war, but if it meant doing nonviolent civil disobedience and sitting in, and then do jail no bail. Part of it was just a practicality, because during the civil rights movement, people couldn't afford to, get out. But also, with all due respect, some people were protesting the war. It was do it, but don't get caught. And this is like 1967 during Stop the Draft Week. I had just gotten to San Francisco. Well, while I was in jail in 1967, we were looking at the women who were there, and Joan Baez was there, and her mom was there. And that was probably the first time that I heard people talk about other ways in which we could take our personal participation in the war machine. So when you think about war tax resistance, if you think about war resistance, what are the other parts of what makes war possible? So certainly the money, but it's the bodies as well, and it's the way in which we kind of be complicit. So I'm going to read from my notes because I don't want to wander. But I guess what I would say that April 18th is just coming up. It's not going to be tax time. So the timing of this workshop could not be more fortuitous if people are thinking about it. When my first paying job was at the War Resistance League, and pay was $80 a month. Home was a couch in the office, and I didn't make enough money at that time to worry about it. But what I was struck by was that the War Resistance League was very clear back in 1967, 68, this is during the war in Vietnam, that war tax resistance was front and center in terms of one of the ways in which we could remove our personal complicity, our money. And I was really struck by that. But also, when I think about 1967, 68, it was Joan Baez who, she said, I have a quote in which she said, basically, she acknowledged that just what you just said, Larry, even though they'll get the money, but there's something about giving it proactively or resisting it, and they have to come get it. And if there's that little part, and Mary, that's kind of what you were sharing as well. If there's an understanding about, yeah, there are systems in place, but how do we personally remove our complicity in any way we can? And there are other options that you just laid out as well. So she said basically that, it was 1968. She said, I acknowledge that the government will take my money from my bank and with penalties, just what you said. But the difference is my paying it and they're taking it. And understanding about that level of resistance at least has a sense of one's individual removal of the participation if you don't have other options possible. And I appreciate that. And what would be comparable, if you think about it, during the war in Vietnam, if you remember, because only men could be drafted unless women, what you just said, Mary, wanted to enlist. But then we asked the question, what about those of us who are opposing that war and we can't be drafted because we're women or older? And then we said, maybe what we'll do is we'll do what we call the call to resist. We will tell people, I will aid and abet anyone who decides they want to oppose that war. And if that means counseling young men not to go, and you saw what happened with the conscientious subject, Triple CO as well. But then they made an interesting thing. They wanted to make someone an example. And who did they pick? Dr. Benjamin Spock, who has a book in every household in this country. And then realize when you start thinking about the high level personalities, just like Joan Baez resisting the war, and while they might be personalities, for some people, that's exactly what you need. Somebody who will take that step, someone who embodies it. But then you think about Randy Keeler, who, and Betsy had, if I'm not mistaken, had their home, it was going to be seized because of their opposition to the war in terms of tax resistance as well. I think the other parts that I would say that even though I was too young in 1969 to get my taxes removed, I'm now 73. And I do remember the first time I got a real paying job, I had to file a W-2 and I was not paying the telephone tax. They got me in a minute. So there's a reality of how they can just come get you in terms of what you can or can't do. And then each one of us has to decide how we want to make sure we can resist or not. And now I do this 1099, I'm a consultant now. So I can decide how much money I make or not, but it also makes a difference where you live. Can you do that if you're living in New York City or Boston, some other places? The cost of living also depends intentionally where you live could make a difference of whether you even have the potential to make a possibility of having the ability to not make enough. Like thinking, I know Joanne Sheehan's on here and I know Craig's on here, and people who purposely do it in a way that they'll never have enough money to pay. Excuse me, take a sip of water. So I guess I'm trying to do a big picture of, for those who have the ability to, and those who can share their stories, it's important to hear it. Because you know who I'm thinking about? All those 18-year-olds that will be old enough to start paying their taxes. And what do we do with that huge generation? The population now, I think, is about, I think when I just mentioned earlier, the 18 to 40-year-olds now outnumber us baby boomers. And when you think about how you can pass that information on or intentionally do intergenerational. So a couple of more things that I just want to share. Look what I found. I remember Bob Calvert in Bob Calvert back in 1971 wrote, "Ain't Gonna Pay for War No More." Remember that booklet that I think WRL put out? But here's the War Tax Resistant Guide that Ed Hedeman, had done in 1970 and then updated in 1988. So that precedes what you have now, Lincoln, with the the PowerPoint and all that wonderful stuff you have. But I think about how this book and that pie chart is such an icon. It's been in different languages as well about how you can actually look at where the money goes and how you decide. And Mary, didn't you say every time you filed those, you put one of those pie charts in or something you would send to the IRS, which I think is great. So I'll just wrap up with a couple of more things to share, and then we can open it up. So yeah, the guide to WTR that Ed Hedeman did was in 1981, updated in 1988. Now this is something we did when I joined the WRL office here in Durham, the War Resisters League Southeast office in 1982. They would do, and I think New York did it, other people would do it. Every time people had to file their taxes on tax day, you would go down to the post office, cars would be backed up because they could throw their tax forms into like a big old tray or whatever. We would stand out there with that huge pie chart. We would sing songs, giving people a visual idea that there are people opposed to the idea of how you're paying your taxes for war. And then I remember during the Vietnam War era, remember the Another Mother for Peace put out that thing is, what would happen if the military had to sell cakes and pies in order to get the money they needed for the machines of war? And I think how creative we can be with that right now, with this stuff with, Zoom and the internet, about how you can actually make the point about how money gets spent. And then the final thing I would say, and I know Joanne's on here and I hope she will speak up as well, about how WRL, I think New England chapter, but how do you actually advocate and getting it into audience that you normally would not have any conversation with? I mean, right now I'm thinking we have like so many schools here in North Carolina, but trying to think about some of these schools and whether or not if you get a job at a school, what's the policy about whether you have the ability to resist your taxes or not, and trying to think creatively about what that might be. And then finally, I think here's another reality check. Helen, with this, WRL would always put offices near military installations or military things. I am sitting in Durham, North Carolina. We are a 2-hour drive from Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune, Cherry Point, Seymour Johnson, and the list goes on and on. And all those institutions are now over, not only in Ukraine, but that has been every war in the past, present, and potentially in the future. So if you want to know what the more taxes pay for, and you want to see the reality of what that looks like, head down to Fayetteville. But also they have a Quaker house. And this was we get into the Friends. Because I like the idea that if you have a sitting institution of militarism and war, there has to be also another institution or some kind of embodiment of says, no, we're going to resist that. So those are the Friends meeting houses. That's the Quaker house. And you think about the American Friends Service Committee. So we were in a moment, it's now 2022 and trying to think over the next 5 or 10 years, where do we go? But what are the realities of what we can do or not do? Oh, and let me add Craig Simpson, thank you, another tax resistor, in terms of what the reality could be. So I'll wrap it up by saying this. My mind's full. That song, it's not just a book, but Ain't Gonna Pay for War No More. If we could have that in 10 or 12 different languages, that'd be great. But also now someone asked the question, what about immigrants? What about people who don't always just speak English first? And when they get their jobs and other ways they can be involved. So Lincoln, that whole thing you put up in terms of tax resistance and what the do's and don'ts, I think is really informative. So I'll stop now. And I have to admit, now I pay my taxes. I have to. I am on Social Security right now. That's the only thing I can live on. And I'm sitting here trying to think about realistically, but I can certainly advocate. I can certainly partner with and be a part of this conversation, could be part of that as well. So with a huge thank you to you all, I guess we can get into the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mandy. Thanks, everybody. I've gotten a couple more questions in the chat, and so feel free to put more in there. I think I'm just going to throw out a few possible topics and just see if especially Mary and Larry and Mandy want to want to talk about them. So let's see, one that I saw come up a couple of times was the question of redirection. I know Mary talked about that a lot, but maybe some specifics about, what are these redirection funds? How do they work? I know there are at least a couple of people who are wondering about that, and that might also be something that could go, in the chat with links or something like that. So redirection is one of them. A theme that I saw kind of emerging from what Larry said and questions about it was questions of diversity and unity. Seeing a diversity within the war tax resistance movement. You can question whether it should be called a movement because it's so kind of dispersed. But diversity as a strength, but maybe disunity as a weakness. And just thinking about that. And if anyone has more thoughts on that topic, that seems to be kind of something that's alive for people that people are thinking about. So I guess maybe that's kind of thing number 2 that I noticed. And let's see, maybe ideas of institutions we can organize through. I heard Mandy mentioning the idea of institutions, and I think we could share some kind of knowledge and connections about those. And then another question that I heard in Mandy's talk was, how do we share this with new audiences? Thinking about younger generations, especially, or people who have never thought about this particular way to resist. How do we connect what those of us who have been doing this for a long time, have done and are doing with people who are new to this and haven't thought about it. Anyway, that's kind of a big collection of things, but I would invite anyone who wants to share thoughts on it, on any of them, to go ahead, and we can see where the conversation goes.
Just briefly, and then I'll pipe down. I mean, what Lincoln provided helpful information about the New England War Tax Resistance Alternative Fund, which Mary and I have the pleasure of, using to fund really fantastic organizations. Just want to, money can go there. But I want to make clear something that Lincoln also said in the chat, namely, you can send the money there. That's great. And it will be used, we promise you, from now till, the coming of the Messiah, for excellent purposes. But you can't do that and say to the federal government, hey, I gave to the Neuter Alternative Fund, do I still have to pay taxes? Because the answer is, yeah, you do. The government guards very jealously its power to tax. The unity and diversity question is the sort of third rail, I think, here, because I don't know how to talk about it in such a way as not to get people's, backs up or set their teeth on edge. I mean, I will say only that, 15, 20 years ago, a bunch of people from Neuter, from New England War Tax Resistance, went to have a meeting with some people at the Albert Einstein Institute, which is the institute founded by Gene Sharp and devoted to his work. And we were trying to figure out the things that people connected with Gene Sharp know about, like how you organize to bring down a dictator or whatever you want to organize for. And the guy we talked to, I think I still have the minutes, said basically, as far as he could tell from talking with us, that we weren't a movement in the first place. We weren't a campaign, we weren't a movement, we didn't have identifiable goals. As a group, we had a lot of community feeling and a lot of solidarity and a lot of morale and a lot of mutual aid. That was all great, but we weren't a movement, so he didn't really think that he could help us be a more effective movement because we weren't a movement in the first place. Anyway, I'm just reporting what he said on that occasion.
If I could just jump in real quick, I was sitting here. The other people I thought about is Wally and Juanita Nelson. I'm sitting here thinking about people who, from the get, just because of, background or their lifestyles, whatever, and I guess what I'm intrigued by is just how you take an idea and how, I guess, and how that means that each individual person, however they define they can, can remove their personal complicity in whichever that might be, like Vietnam is not it's my body or the money. Oftentimes it might just be the idea that you give an idea, you give an inkling of an idea. But also here's the one, who's making all these IRS tax laws? Anyone running for the US House has to come get our vote every 2 years. Why are we giving it to them? Do we even know who they are? The US Senate. You know, so if you look at why do these policies exist? And the fact that they made it almost near impossible. Oh, look at that little one. Catherine, what's the little baby's name? Who is that?
Mrs. Elizabeth. She woke up and was crying, so I went and scooped her up.
That could be a potential war tax resistor right there, Lizzie. That'd be so cute.
Maybe.
Anyway, but I was getting to the idea, though. I think it's like if there's a way from the very beginning, before you even have to think about filing taxes, that you're given the information from the very beginning. And not always thinking you have to always resist it the way we think of it, but more about what would be other ways you can live your life, have quality of life, but you collectivize it. So now you have communities where they literally live in community where they don't have to pay taxes just because of the way their structure is, or how each individual, you know, can contribute. So it's almost like are there other ways you can you resist the institution, but not always feeling you have to fight it all the time. Like, you know, I have to fight it all the time. It's more how creative can be. Mary, I'm looking at your buttons behind you. How many buttons do you have and how many movements did that represent? And I'll stop there, but I'm just thinking, and I like to pass it on to also Joanne and some other folks and Craig who do this organizing and others on this call. But I'm also thinking about each one of us, we're still here trying to figure this thing out collectively and trying to think about how we come up with ideas, share them, and pass them on, or like quantify them, you know, in terms of how that could be, especially generationally. But that'd be the one thing I would just put into the mix. I'll pass it on to someone else.
I'll just pipe in that I have been part of movements, and there are some elements of movement that are lacking within war tax resistance. But even within organized movements, there is diversity of thought. There are different personal choices. And it's very important that each of us within whatever movement that we're a part of do what is right for us. But movements do come together and coalesce on a goal. On interim goals, on strategies that are collective. And what we have done as war tax resistors, though there have been collective resistance campaigns in the past, currently that I'm aware of, we are each doing our own form of resistance, whether it's resisting $10.40 of our taxes, half of the taxes, all of the taxes, paying it all and sending a letter. Whatever we're doing is okay. And there has been, in my history of war tax resistance, some judgment within war tax resistors of each other. And our individual choices about how we go about it, which was pure. I used to think I wasn't a good tax resistor because of what I did. I've come to a different understanding. But I think it is, if we were to organize campaigns, we would need to decide together on, you know, some public statements, some unified strategy that does also recognize our own individual consciences and strategies for our own personal consciences. But I think we have. I remember there were campaigns during previous wars to resist telephone taxes because those went for the war effort, or to resist in a certain way. But that hasn't been my experience lately.
Actually, I was going to respond to a couple questions. Some were public in the chat and some were more direct to myself. But there was someone had asked a question about if you're self-employed, what about starting a certain type of LLC or some other sort of, corporation in your state or some other, way of trying to protect yourself. And I would just state that's something to definitely talk to a lawyer about. The National War Tax Resistance Office is more geared towards letting people know what are the risks, and if some of those risks come to fruition, different paths forward based on your situation. But essentially, to give any advice about what's the, is an LLC the way to go for a certain self-employed person, it really depends on what you're doing. And, and there's the fact that incorporation or the creation of things like LLC are by state. And so even though there's a lot of commonalities from state to state about how those things are organized, technically, depending on what state you're in, there's different laws. So I'm in Wisconsin, an LLC is technically different here than in New Hampshire, than in California, and different sorts of corporations are different from state to state. It's the reason that most banks incorporate in Delaware, because they have the best incorporation laws for banks. So talking to a lawyer, lawyers are definitely who do that sort of work. Their specialty is looking at your situation and what gives you the greatest tax advantage. Even though the lawyer might not be a war tax resistance lawyer or even support it, that's what all of their people want to know. What's the best way to avoid taxes or to lower my tax, debt? And so a lawyer would be the best person to talk to about that. There was also a question about are there CPAs that, are kind of NUTRIC approved, and I'd kind of use the same similar answer. Even though, my undergrad is in accounting, most of my classmates, I would say, are probably pretty conservative and would be against war tax resistance. But the one thing they have in common with most war tax resistors is they want to do everything they can to lower your tax liability. And, they wouldn't be the people to ask about, if I don't pay, what will happen, because they didn't study that. I didn't study that. That wasn't part of accounting training. You just learn how to do taxes or how to put together a proper set of accounting books. But they are the people that could say, in your situation, what's the best way to lower your tax debt? And any accountant is fine. And then lastly, I'll just finish. We do have, there's been a lawyer who's been a part of NUTRIC almost since the very beginning, Peter Goldberger. And when on the very rare instances when someone's been criminally charged, he has, come and provided his advice, sometimes represented people. And, but we always say, if you have something come up like that, that you're like, I think this is a question for a lawyer for Peter, contact the office, email me, call the office. Peter kind of uses me as the funnel because 99% of the time I already know the answer because we've already dealt with it. But every once in a while, there is something that we haven't heard of before, or it's been a while, and then I'll contact Peter and get him involved. And he's very happy to help because he's not a war tax resistor himself, but he's been involved with NUTRIC since the early 80s. He respects the movement, he respects what we do, and he wants to support us in any way he can. So I'll leave it there and leave it to the rest of our panelists.
I'll just say that as a low-income person, I've sometimes used the services of the free tax help that is available to low-income people. And I tell them, no, I don't want my taxes to be electronically filed because I'm going to send them a letter telling them why I'm not paying half of it. And I show them a draft of the letter, and they're, people are surprised. They're often not aware that this is something that people can do, but people have really been very respectful. And and when you get levied, I mean, this hasn't happened to me probably since the 90s or the early aughts, but when my employer is contacted about my war tax resistance, it's an opportunity to talk to people about it and spread the word. This happened once when I was an employee of a shelter for homeless families. And when I told people what I was doing, they knew that housing and homelessness was underfunded, and said, we all should be doing this. So it's a relationship building opportunity when you're public. And that's something I really appreciate about how Larry goes about what he does is, he writes letters and sends them to representatives, sends them to local news, and that's really important.
I jump in here since Mandy volunteered me repeatedly. Folks, yeah, this is Joanne Sheehan. I'm with War Sisters League in New England, and I've been part of the New England War Tax Resistance community for most of its life, I guess. For 25 years, we met regularly. So I think those of us in New England have had that opportunity to both get together, talk, meet each other, support each other, have arguments with each other. Yes, there's been judgment of, yeah, this is pure, whatever. We also had Wally and Juanita Nelson as part of us. And so we always had those incredible kind of models and inspiration. So I think there's three quick things I want to say. One is we are the experts in this. And while I realize that there are people on this call who are new, and there are people on this call who have been doing this for a long time and know each other. So I want to not get into the just talk to my friends on this as well. But I think that one of the things that's important is to realize that we have become the experts, that we being Ruth Ben is on, Lincoln is on, those of us, that's why we have Newtrick. That's why we have War Sisters League, so that we gather that information. And I understand it's very natural for people getting new into something to say, where's your lawyer? Where's your CPA? Where's your experts, right? And to recognize we are the ones who've been collecting those stories, getting that information, learning what we need to learn. And when we don't, those of us who are more local counselors, we call on the others, and we're thankful for now all the stuff on the website. Like Mandy said, we've also had handbooks for years. So just for those who are newer and really are less experienced with this, encourage you that we may not be a movement, but we're a community. We have each other, we have ways of supporting folks. And when people do need that level of support, sometimes it's a matter of people will call here to the New England WRL office just to talk about it. Just because we need that. Just like parents call whose kids don't register for selective service and need that as well, right? So we just kind of lend an ear, here's my experience. Oh, if you have that question, call Lincoln kind of thing. So I think that's important. Yeah, I don't think we're a movement. I think of myself as a kind of movement strategist, but we are a community. I think that there is a difference between doing something as individuals and making personal choices and doing something kind of collectively and seeing it in that larger political realm. And I think that for those of us who act in conscience, whether that be, as many people have said, around both war tax resistance or going into the military or what kind of job we take. I mean, there's many, what stores we shop in, all sorts of ways that we're challenged on that. I think that has an impact. And for what has an impact on me, right? Remember that there's so many quotes we could give now of kind of, I don't do it just to change the world. I do it so the world doesn't change me. And so I think that for me is an important piece of what we do, and that there have been times when we did have something more like a campaign where we were trying to kind of collectively do something. But I don't think that disvalues it. I think it puts it in a different realm. And like Larry said, particularly those of us here, I think in New England, I've seen it at times when we've gotten together as New England War Tax Resistance and people wanted to have more workshops on how to live simply than on how to develop strategy. And that kind of was the reality oftentimes of our kind of getting together. And for me, as somebody who has made the choice, and I made the choice for a lot of reasons, I'm inspired by the Catholic worker movement. I'm inspired by many other many other reasons to live on less money. I think I'm a better global citizen, if you will, by doing that. That also means that you're not putting your unpaid taxes, because you don't really have unpaid taxes or a lot of extra money, into that fund. But what I think is really important is that I do put work into my community. I put an enormous amount of work, probably far more work in than I would ever be able to put money in, right? I've become an expert on community land trusts, and I've started a couple, and I've helped do that kind of work. And I think a lot of us do. A lot of us who are, maybe those who are not inspired by getting involved in a campaign are still doing mutual aid in their communities, and they're doing all sorts of wonderful things during the pandemic and well before that. And we're probably more ready to jump into doing that during the pandemic, because that is something that we've done with each other. So I do think that kind of, while we do this as individuals, we do it within a community, we do it within different political circles. And I've just a couple things about outreach. The other day, Don't Look Up was the movie in our local nonprofit theater. And so we went with the pie chart, we went with a leaflet we made connecting the issue of climate change and nuclear weapons, and gave that stuff out, right? And while there were some people there we knew and had seen the pie chart, it's a new audience. I've talked to a lot of community colleges. That's a great place to get into these conversations with folks, like, why do you pay your local tax and not your federal tax? And kind of all of those kinds of issues come up. So kind of finding those kinds of places, and we all know that there are also people who take the pie chart and go to your library and just stick it in the pamphlets for the when people take it as to how to fill out their tax form. So yeah, I do think that's really important, getting it out there. So I'll stop talking now. Thanks everybody for today.
It reminded me of one other question that came up, which was announcements about April actions. We may not all be, located near each other and able to attend each other's actions, but if people have things planned for April and you want to tell about them, it could help share some ideas.
Hello.
I can just share that we don't have the list up on the Nutric website yet. We're still collecting actions, but if you're doing an action around tax day, please let me know. I'll add it to our list. But for our latest newsletter in April, that'll be going to the printer shortly. We're going to have it's a growing list, but probably within the next week, if you go to the Nutric website, it'll be one of the most prominent things to click on is go to our tax day information and the list of actions. It's not up today, but it will be shortly.
I'll also say that the WRL store is here now in New England, and so the pie charts are here. Please order them. If you order them online, I get them out within 2 days. They go right out. And anybody who puts in the note there that they're having an action, I tell them to let you know. So just kind of people, somebody ordered 75 the other day, they're going to be leafleting. And I think it is a little harder, right? Mandy talked about being at the post office. We always did very creative things at the post office. Nobody goes to the post office on tax day anymore. So you have to be a little more creative, although people have found places to be. And the War Industry Resistors Network is doing a whole series of things around Tax Week at weapons facilities and weapons corporations. So there are people who are kind of finding other ways to kind of say, hey, this is your tax, this is your tax dollars at work. And particularly around nuclear weapons this year because of the fear of nuclear weapons because of what's happening over Ukraine.
Can I make a few comments? Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I had a few comments and I wanted to make a short announcement about an event. Over the decades, I belonged to two local groups that were doing war tax resistance. And in both groups, we set up alternative tax funds in which people deposited their redirected taxes. And then we had press conferences and we gave grants out groups and places, programs that we thought should be getting the money. But most people did not put all of their redirected taxes into those alternative funds. They also made personal redirections on their own to places that they chose themselves to do. In one of the groups that I belong to, there were several people who were a little bit heavy-handed about it, and they were very strict about who you were allowed to redirect your money to and who was acceptable as a recipient and who was not. And that was a little bit too strict for me. So I left that group and I joined another group, which was a little bit looser about it, about, you know, who you can give your money to and who not, which is a political group, and et cetera, et cetera. For instance, I direct a lot of my taxes to the War Resisters League, and some people tell me that that's a political group and you shouldn't be giving your money to a political group like that, and which is something that I don't agree with at all. But anyway, I'm with a group now that's much looser about that, so I don't get scrutinized as much about where I redirect my money. Newtrick came out with a video a few years ago where they interviewed about 15 people, and each person described their way, their style of war tax resistance, and each person had a different way of doing it. And this was very illustrative of how diverse the war tax resistance movement is. People have their own way of doing it, and every way is creative, and it's full of diversity. And I think that's something that's very, very good. And I think we definitely need to enlarge the war tax resistance movement, but let's not be too strict about standardizing how exactly we encourage people to resist their war taxes and do it. Let's keep it diverse. And finally, I'd like to announce that if you can make it to New York City on April 18th, we will be having our annual protest outside the IRS headquarters in downtown Manhattan. And if you can't make it to Manhattan for the action, then do something in your own local community. That's it.
Can I ask if, I don't want to put Craig on the spot, but I remember, Craig, you know, we've been working on this thing to make this thing happen today, but I didn't, you know, Joanne shared what she and Rick are doing without putting you on the spot, but how have you been doing your own level of tax resistance, Craig Simpson, if you're okay?
I'm not.
You're not?
I'm keeping it a low income.
Oh, good. That's what I meant about what would be the way in which you, just like Joanne and others would, like the Wally and Juanita, but just hearing a little bit of your story, if you don't mind. Just
Well, that's why I avoided the spotlight, is that I'm not actually doing it, but I'm supporting it. So, but I'm making very little money, just Social Security, and trying to shed my what I have. So, but I'll, yeah, I'm listening to this today. I was resisting in the, before I, quite a long time, between 1970 to about 89 when I moved to Boston, and I had to get a job and they took all the money. So, but I've lived below the taxable income, so.
And can I just follow up real quick? Maybe the term, and maybe Lincoln weigh in, if you're not using the term tax resistance, but because you're purposely living below the level that you have to pay it, what would you call that? There's another way of being involved, and maybe there's another word for it, because that's what you're doing as well, and other people as well. So you might, I mean, is there a delineation? Maybe someone can help me. Lincoln, like if you say I'm doing war tax resistance, but you're removing, you're part of that, and that might mean living below the income level that you have to pay it. Is there another word we can use? Because a lot of people might decide that that's an avenue for them to pursue, and it's doable. Maybe, am I asking the question right?
Yeah, and no, your question makes perfect sense. I we really don't differentiate. The only differentiation we really use is legal and illegal. Because living simply is, a form of resistance. It either means, as for most folks who live simply, you're obviously living without some things, some luxuries, or perhaps in order to have enough, especially if you're in a place that costs more money to live in, you might be living in community. And I've lived in community, and I know there are pluses to it, but it's also not the easiest thing to do. It is a sacrifice. I would call it a form of resistance. At least within the war tax resistance movement that I'm familiar with, we definitely would consider both forms a form of resistance, because living on less, using less resources, especially in this day and age where we have a greater understanding of our impact on the world and the environment, is something very valuable.
That reminds me of something that I don't think we've said so far in this discussion, is that an individual war tax resistor has opportunities to make choices all along the way. So if you start out doing war tax resistance by earning below the taxable income or by not paying some percentage, that doesn't mean you have to do that for the rest of your life. As your life changes, your form of resistance may change. The IRS communicates. They may not communicate in nice ways, but they communicate. So if you get a letter from the IRS that says, hey, you didn't owe X amount of dollars for this year, you have a choice how to respond to that. You can ignore it. You can respond and say, I'm not paying it. You can respond and say, I'll pay some of it. You can respond and say, I'm not paying any of it. There are many choices along the way before the IRS can take action against you legally to withhold from your paycheck or take money from your bank account. So, and along the way, you can talk to people who have been through this all along and can give you their experience and advice about what to do. Like when I was going in to talk to the IRS, I called up people and said, okay, what's going to happen? What should I be prepared for? And what are some creative ways that other people have reacted when they did this? So I could learn from other people's experience when I was making choices about how I would respond.
Mary, what you're saying just reminded me of an important point that you made, just to expand a little bit. Unless someone is practicing fraud, even though you might be refusing to pay taxes, which is illegal, the IRS will normally only use its civil division, its collection division. They don't, very rarely, and at least as recently, have not used their criminal division for someone who is not practicing fraud. Just as long as you're not putting false information on your tax forms. And so in that sense, war tax resistance would be different than, let's say, robbing a bank. If someone robs a bank and then afterwards is like, oh, I think I might get caught, I'll just bring the money back, they're still going to jail. But with war tax resistance, someone could resist for years, and then, if you get to a point where someone is thinking to themselves, I'm uncomfortable with this, I don't think I can do this anymore, if they could go into a payment plan with the IRS and you'll just pay it off and you won't go, that's all they want is the money. The bank would feel differently. They don't want just the money, they want to make an example of you. But with the IRS, they just want the money. And in one sense, you could always kind of remove yourself from the situation if it got to that point of discomfort.
That's exactly what Wally and Juanita Nelson, who probably people don't know on this call that are unfamiliar with them, they were a couple that didn't pay taxes from 1948 till the day they died. And I'll say they never got it. So, but they would always say that they'll always accept the money back. They're very pleasant when you come in and want to pay. It's just before that. And Wally sat in front of a truck in a driveway in New Mexico in some deserted village. And when the IRS was trying to tow away their car, and they just gave up because all the community came out and supported them. And then they never came again. So there's a lot of things you can do.
Oh, and I worked for a nonprofit, and when the IRS sent them a letter saying, you should withhold this money from Mary's paycheck and give it to us because she owes us money, I gave them the organization information about organizational tax resistance. The organization did not choose to be an organization that did tax resistance, but they did send a letter to the IRS that said, we think this issue is between you, the IRS, and our employee, and we're not getting involved.
Right.
And that was enough of a bump in the road for the IRS, enough of an obstacle that the IRS sort of backed off. They're underfunded and understaffed. That won't always be the case, but that was my experience.
Yeah, can I come back to Mandy's question for a couple of minutes? Because I got a lot of admiration for people who live in simplicity. I think that's actually a quite radical form of resistance. But I'm not sure that what it's resisting is war, specifically. I mean, actually, a thing that we've talked about remarkably seldom this afternoon is war, except in Lincoln's presentation, right? And a person who says, I don't want to be part of this appalling, exploitative cash nexus of a system is doing something heroic. But I don't see it as focused specifically on war. I mean, I think not unless some other action is taken to suggest that it's focused specifically on war. So
Larry, when someone takes 60% of your money and is going to war, machines, people, what else are you going to call it? What do you mean not resisting war?
Because they're not paying any taxes to any of the functions of federal government. Isn't that true?
No, not at all.
Well, how is it not true?
When you look at the pie, like when you look at the
pie chart.
Yeah. And so if you know that 60% and more of that is going into military, now when you define military, it might not just be the machines, but it's also all the infrastructure that you have. I'm a little confused about what you mean about you're not resisting that. It's the same thing when people said you can't take my body and put me into the machine that you want me to go off to some place. But it's the money that also keeps that machine going. It's money, it's people. So I'm a little confused about when you say it's not doing, when you're not resisting war because you're not paying the actual physical money. I'm missing the point.
It depends on people's motivation. There may be people who earn below the taxable income for various reasons. But if it's in order to avoid tax liability that pays for war, then it's tax resistance.
That's my.
But yeah, and I think this is where you have the intersections of issues too, right? So that for me, I don't want to pay for federal prisons either.
Right.
I don't want to pay for the kinds of housing policy that puts a lot of money into the pockets of landlords through Section 8, but does not provide home ownership opportunities enough for low-income people, right? And supports or allows the discrimination against people of color in housing. So to me, there's so much of that's why I said before that for me, it's a matter of, all right, as kind of basically an anarchist. Okay, so I have responsibility though to those people or to those issues. How do I enact that, right? So for some people, they do it in different ways. And for me, it's been being able to put time into doing that kind of work that I feel is what Gandhi called constructive program. So there's this kind of holistic approach for me to kind of, there's my resistance, my saying no, and there's my saying yes. And what do I say yes to? And like, we can't do all of it, but what dimension of society do you feel most called to kind of help foster and say yes to? And of the names brought up here. Chuck Matthai is one of those people who helped me, kind of inspired me to do community land trust work. I lived at Community for Nonviolent Action, so was Bob Swan. So I just kind of, that is what, that's what I landed in, but people land in lots of other places. So I think that I look at a lot of tax resistors as people who are not just against war, but see those connections. But you're right, but we call ourselves war tax resistors. So I think Larry has that, everybody's got a piece of the truth in this argument here in terms of kind of what we call it, but it's a lot of it is more of a resistance to a whole system of things that we see as violent and militaristic. Maybe that's kind of an underpinning, to it. But yeah, and I would look at people certainly like Wally and Juanita and others who would, also see those connections. So, yeah.
I know or maybe you're about to break in with this, Catherine. I know we're nearing maybe a little over what we were initially thinking for our time, but if there's any last questions or panelists have any final comments, now would be the time.
Yeah, I'd like to, just briefly, I promise. I've made a lot of statements about war tax resistance in the time that I've been doing it. And at each moment, I'm entirely convinced by the statement that I'm making, including this afternoon. But I'm also aware, as I look back on 35 years, of the way in which, if you keep doing this, you and your life and your mode of war tax resistance, they're all changing. Because the moment we stop changing, we die, basically. So it's interesting for me to imagine what this conversation would have been like 10 years ago, or might be like 10 years from now. The way in which we all find ourselves at a particular place, in a particular moment, in a particular state of being. So that's been striking for me this afternoon.
Huge thank you to everybody.
Yeah, thank you to everybody who participated on the panel, all the participants. You spent part of your precious Sunday with us, and thank you.
Yes.
And a pitch for the 100th anniversary of the War Resisters League. We're planning that now. It's not until 2023, but kind of wraps us all into this wonderful, and I'd love to have everyone on board for that as well. So huge thank you. Larry, Mary, Lincoln, Catherine, who am I missing? And everyone else who's on here as well. And I guess who's going to see this after, because those who couldn't join us, they'll be able to take a view of it later. But